Hello and welcome again to Eastridge Connection. Last week we tried to present really just some information for you. If you haven't watched last week's podcast, please do that. This week we're going to focus upon a particular passage. We're looking at Matthew chapter 14. If you want to go ahead and open your Bible and turn to that text. We thought it'd be a good way to follow what we presented last week. We thought it would be a good way to follow that this week by simply focusing and spending some time on the topic of faith over fear. There's so many different places we could turn within Scripture, but if you look in the Gospel accounts, the Gospels tell the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. If you look at the different passages within the Gospels, you'll see the story told of the event of Jesus and his disciples. They're trying to spend some time by themselves. They're trying to spend some time away from society, and they're seeking to utilize that time for a spiritual benefit. John the Baptist has just been killed, and John, of course, Jesus' cousin, and someone that they were very close to. And so Jesus and his disciples, they sail from one side of the Sea of Galilee to the other with the intention of spending intentional time with God and with each other. But then as they land on the other side of the Sea of Galilee, they are met by thousands upon thousands of people. And we have the event that's referred to as the feeding of the 5,000. I think it's Mark's account that gives the description that as they land there on the shore and they're met by the people, that Jesus has compassion upon the people because he sees them as sheep without a shepherd. After the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus goes and does what his original intention was to do. He goes up on a mountainside by himself to pray, to spend uninterrupted time with God. He sends his disciples to the other side of the Sea of Galilee by boat. If you read the different passages in the gospel accounts, you'll see that the description is Jesus is up on this mountainside praying to God. It's during the fourth watch of the night with a Roman way of keeping time. That would have been about 3 a.m. And so at 3 a.m., the gospel accounts describe Jesus as looking across the Sea of Galilee and seeing his closest friends struggling. They're in trouble because a storm has come upon the Sea of Galilee and they're in distress. And so Jesus, think about this, 3 o'clock in the morning, in the middle of the storm, he sees his closest friends struggling in this boat, and he walks upon the water to help them. And so I want you to pick up with me in Matthew chapter 14, and I'm going to begin in verse 22. Jesus immediately made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it's you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat and he walked on the water and he came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You have little faith," he said. "Why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Most of us have a heading in our Bibles over this passage. And generally, the heading will read, Jesus walks on the water. At the same time, something that we might also, or we might often miss, is the fact that Peter walks on the water too. And sometimes whenever we focus upon this passage, we focus upon Peter initially stepping out of the boat and walking on water. What we maybe don't focus on is the fact that there are we give Peter a hard time because we feel like, okay, Peter steps out, he takes his eyes off of Jesus, but what we miss is that there are 11 other guys in the boat who don't have the faith to step out. And yet, if you look at the text, it describes Peter as he steps out of the boat and as he begins to walk toward Jesus. Where he or when he begins to sink is not necessarily when he takes his eyes off of Jesus, although perhaps that's true. The text reads that when Peter begins to sink, it is because he is paying attention to the wind and to the waves and to the chaos that is surrounding him. When the Apostle Peter, who steps out on faith, begins to focus upon the turmoil around him, it's then that he begins to sink. And so that's where we want to begin, with this truth of faith over fear and how God calls us to be a people of faith, recognizing that there are concerns and fears in this world, and especially addressing our current cultural climate. But faith over fear with the things that concern us. Okay, and so with that, as a beginning, Ryan, thoughts just kind of picking up from there, or where you're at with some of this?
Well, I think first of all, I think you hit the nail on the head that the key takeaway in Peter's moment of sinking is he's distracted by the fact that life has gotten really hard again. That he's drawn to the wind and the waves of his life. And granted, I say that as though it's a metaphor. It's actual wind and waves for Peter. For us, it's more of a metaphor. Yeah. But for Peter, he's drawn to the actual wind and the waves. And when they draw his attention, he begins to sink. But there's something about this passage that really stands out to me. I want to back up just a minute to verse 26. But when I'm reading from the ESV, so it says, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It's a ghost," and they cried out in fear. Something about that passage really resonates with me. If you don't know, I work generally as a counselor, and I work with people who are in very difficult moments of their life. The disciples in this moment see Jesus. They actually see him in the midst of this chaos. But they're so afraid that they mistake him for something he's not. They mistake him for something scary. They mistake him for something that's there to harm them, or something that's there to create more chaos. And I say that because I think at times, with the benefit of hindsight, we can look back through those hard moments that we have in our lives. And I think we can see Jesus in the middle of the storm. But when we're in the storm, it's really easy to mistake the hand of the Lord, to mistake the work that Jesus is doing in our lives as something frightening. And that phrase really stands out to me. And they cried out in fear, "It's a ghost," as soon as they recognized him. Just because, again, the idea that we don't recognize Jesus in the midst of chaos, I think has been the case since he was literally walking the face of the earth with us. I also am...
It doesn't make sense to them for him to be there in that moment.
In the middle of the chaos, because if he were there, then the chaos wouldn't be around. And that's one of the things that I think we make a mistake as humans of thinking that chaos in our lives means Jesus is not there. That hurt and pain and struggle in a moment like this in our culture means Jesus must not be concerned. He must be absent in the situation. I think we back up to Jesus calming the storm. That was the accusation. The accusation was, "Don't you care if we drown? You must be so uninvolved in our lives that you don't even care what's happening to us." And I think we have evidence here that in the middle of chaos, in the middle of a moment where waves are big and wind is blowing, Jesus is still there. Even if we don't recognize him, and even if we see him and mistake him for something dangerous or for something scary, it doesn't mean Jesus isn't there. The problem in that moment of the disciples mistaking Jesus for something scary, that's not a God problem. That's not a Jesus problem. That's a human problem. That's our eyes only allow us to see that. So that was the first thing that popped out. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we need to focus on as well, in verse 32, when Jesus steps into their boat, and then he calms the wind and the waves, and so they don't expect that it's how is this possible? It doesn't make sense that Jesus would be here, and yet when they recognize, yes, this is what's going on. This is what he's doing. Peter steps out. Jesus reaches out. He saves Peter. The two of them step into the boat, and then as soon as Jesus steps into the boat, as soon as Jesus steps among them in that boat, then the wind and the waves are quieted, and their response, verse 33. Is to fall at his feet in worship, and I think that's significant. The Apostle Paul in Romans 12, he'll let us know worship is not confined to 1 hour a week. Worship is who we are and what we're about and what we do and how we respond. Worship is 24/7. And I think one of the things that we can learn from, especially that part of the passage, is that the result of faith, of true abiding faith, the result of faith is worship. And not even necessarily worship in what we might consider a traditional sort of sense. Worship in the sense of praising and acknowledging God for who He is, trusting and relying upon God because He's God. The difference between belief and faith is action. The next level from belief. It's one thing to believe in God, but the difference between belief and faith is action. Faith is our belief in action. I think about Hebrews chapter 11, that great chapter of faith. And you've got all of those heroes, by faith Abraham, by faith Isaac, by faith Jacob, by faith Moses, all of these heroes of faith. Every last one of those stories is a story of fear over faith. And the result...
Faith over fear.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Either we'll edit that or we'll leave it in.
That's
because
all right.
it'll be funny.
Let's keep rolling. Faith over fear.
Have I said that every time?
No, that's the first time.
The result of those stories out of Hebrews 11 is faith over fear, and the result of faith, when genuine, when true, when real, when honest, the result of faith is worship, worship of every moment and in everyday life. Thoughts?
Well, so you said action. There is an action that takes place prior to that moment where they're back in the boat that happens twice, and Jesus' response to that action in both circumstances is the same. So the action is, if we look at verse 26 of this passage, when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And what did they do? They cried out in fear. And at that moment, Jesus revealed himself. So they cried out to Jesus. They cried out in fear. And at that moment, Jesus revealed himself. And then if we fast forward just a little bit, Peter does the exact same thing. When he saw the wind and was afraid, he began to sink and cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him. So we've got an action that takes place in a moment of fear, in a moment of abject terror. So we're talking right now about fear because our culture is experiencing something very new. We're socially isolated. We're distanced from each other. We have varying levels of fear of even this virus. I think from person to person, you have a different response of, either extreme, where on one end, this is no worse than the flu and this is all crazy what we're doing. And then on the other end, I won't go to my living room without a hazmat suit. Most of us are somewhere in the middle on that spectrum. But the reality is we're in a moment of great fear and of great panic. If we can look at the reality of this moment in Matthew, these men are in what I believe to be the scariest possible position, which is a storm, a great, massive storm in the middle of a dark ocean. I can't imagine a more frightening, terrifying situation to be in. That kind of fear, I think, would be so much more palpable and tangible. I know we're afraid now as a culture, but if you can imagine being in a little boat in the middle of crashing waves and it's dark and you have no idea which direction the waves are coming from, the terror and the exhaustion that would come with that, I think is something we don't want to miss in this moment. And what their action was that got them to that calm moment where they were in the boat with Jesus is they cried out. Mm-hmm. I think as a culture right now would be a really good time for us to pay attention to those sentences. Mm-hmm. Now would be a good time for us to cry out to Jesus. Cry out in fear, cry out in hope, cry out in trust, but to cry out to Jesus, to turn our focus towards Jesus as Peter did, to remember his strength and to remember that even in the midst of this chaos, in the midst of this storm, Jesus is still present. I think this story indicates to us that when we cry out in faith, Jesus reveals himself. Mm-hmm. I believe that will be true today as well.
Mm-hmm. So many of these guys are fishermen, and had fished this Sea of Galilee their entire lives. Mm-hmm. For generations. They were well aware of not only their own experiences, but very well of the horror stories of others that have been passed on to them, of different experiences and loss of life and death and that sort of thing. And so along with their being in the moment in this storm and everything that's going on around them, they bring a number of them bring a lot of baggage to that. Yep. And so that's factoring into how they're responding, and yet I think it also illustrates to us that we only find out if our faith is real. We only find out if our faith is strong when we lose control, and we don't do that necessarily very well. Who would ever wish that upon themselves? I wish that I could lose control of certain facets or of all facets of life in order to be able to really solidify and to verify if my faith is true, if it's valid. But I think that's what we see in them, and maybe that's even a little bit of what we're seeing in ourselves. We find out if our faith is strong when we lose control. And whenever we turn that control, give that control over to the only one that truly has control. And I'm comforted by, look at the words of Jesus there in verse 27. Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid. Right. Courage and confidence. And of course, it's after that, whenever Peter's the one that says, tell me to come to you on the water. Jesus says, take courage, have confidence, trust in me. Maybe we give the Apostle Peter a hard time because he begins to sink, but there are 11 other guys in that boat that don't even get out. That's right. How do we overcome fear with faith? That's the question that we ask. But what I want to say is that we overcome fear with faith, and so it's a matter of trusting and having confidence in God and in the promises that He's made to us. And yet our faith it's only truly tested whenever we begin to lose control. And we so like to have control for ourselves.
Well, and you talk about it being tested in moments where we don't have control. And on the other end of that test, if we can endure it, if we can survive it with our faith intact, on the other end of that test is, I think, a level of faith that you can't achieve otherwise. So I am drawn, in addition to what we've already discussed, I'm drawn to the last words in this passage. Verse 32, and when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. Mm-hmm. I believe in the Gospel of Matthew, this is the first time the disciples actually acknowledge Jesus in this way. Demons have done it. Right. So we've seen other moments where Jesus is recognized as the Son of God, but this is the first time that the disciples make this recognition. Now, why is that important? I don't think it needs to be lost on us that at the end of a moment of great fear in the disciples' lives, who Jesus truly was the most evident, that it was the most on display. When Jesus sees you through a storm, the likes of which these men encountered, it's impossible not to look at him and recognize him for who he is. And so, to me, I don't want to lose those last few words. There's so many moments in this passage that are so powerful to me, and they're so applicable. I'm glad you picked it, because there's so many moments in this passage that are so meaningful and applicable to where we are today. But I don't want to lose the fact that these disciples, it took this experience for these disciples to recognize and acknowledge out loud who Jesus truly was. And as a culture, maybe the same thing will be true for us. Hopefully the same thing will be true for us. Hopefully in the midst of this storm, we will begin to see who Jesus truly is. We will begin to recognize who Jesus truly is. And when we get through this, how glorious would it be to hear a culture cry out, "Truly you are the Son of God."
These guys had just seen Jesus feed the masses. We call it the feeding of the 5,000. It's an estimate of 5,000 men.
5,000 men. Yeah.
If it's if it's the average family with 2.5 children, how many people were actually fed? Tens of thousands of people.
Sure.
And his disciples, they had been on the inside of all of that event, seeing how Jesus had multiplied the food and seeing how everyone had been taken care of. They knew that it was completely inexplicable, other than to explain it with the truth that Jesus is who he claims to be.
Absolutely. And
then the very next event is, we're all going to die. And I think that there's maybe a little bit of that in our being human beings.
a lot of human moments.
And so I think there's some human moments in this that maybe we can see ourselves in this. I usually will, at one point or another, maybe in a class or especially in sermons or what have you, I'll quote like my favorite author or maybe some sort of church history figure. I'm going to read just a few words that Ryan and I got yesterday from Jacob Thomason in an email, and I just thought it was really appropriate with what we're looking at today. Jacob, he typed this to us. He says, "It is important in times like these for us, as a people of faith, to lean in on that faith, to turn to the author and perfecter of our faith, to go to him in prayer, and to trust his words. It's important that we lean on his understanding and not on our own understanding." And again, what is faith if it isn't demonstrated whenever it counts? So I think there are some moments to demonstrate faith within what we have going on, what we find ourselves in the midst of right now. At the same time, that's going to take intentionality, and it's going to take a great amount of trust in God. I've got a friend who is he's a priest in East Texas, and so when I say priest, he's a part of a different religious group, obviously. And I can remember a conversation with him a number of years ago where we were differing on a particular bit of theology. And I made the statement, so often our faith is in our belief system, because so much of it is. But at the end of the day, our faith has got to be in God, the God of our belief system. And I think that's some of what we're talking about, to trust in the God of our faith, and to know that He is in control. We find out if our faith is real whenever we lose it, but to recognize that God has it, and He hasn't lost control of this. He can be trusted. God is faithful.
I guess to echo that sentiment to a degree, something that has been on my mind a lot over the last few days is I've been in your sermons for years. I grew up, my dad was a preacher, so I was in his sermons, listening to his sermons as a kid. I've taught more or less, notes, sermons, whatever. I've taught classes here for a number of years. Yeah. This moment, this is what we've been preparing for. Yes, right. This moment should not be unexpected. This moment is not a moment to run screaming for the exits because we question God's involvement, or we question God's care or God's sovereignty. This is what we've been preparing for. All those classes that you've taught over the years, all those sermons that you've preached, those classes that I've preached, or those classes that I've taught, we hit on this same idea that our circumstances don't matter. And that's easy to say when the economy is booming and when we're all paying our bills and when everybody's belly is full. It's easy to say, circumstances don't matter. All that really matters is faith and trusting in the sovereignty of God. That's easy to do when life is comfortable. When you're quarantined at home and you've lost a job, I have no doubt some of the people watching this video have lost jobs in the last 2 weeks. Some of the people watching this video have lost a lot of money in the last 2 weeks. Some of the people watching this video have no idea what's going to happen next. The human part of me completely understands that fear, and as I know you do as well. My heart breaks for those of you in that circumstance, but I want to remind you this morning that this is what we've been preparing for. The idea that we can find our peace in our faith, the idea that our confidence comes from Jesus, our confidence comes from the God that we serve faithfully. This is what we've been preparing for. You are prepared for this. You're ready for this. All those things that you've been doing over the years, all those small group meetings you've had, all those class moments you've had, all those sermon moments that you've had, this has all been preparing you for where we are today. So I want to encourage you this morning, if you're struggling, to remember this is what you've been training for, and it's time to lean on that understanding.
Yeah. Jesus says, "Don't be afraid." That's right. Don't be afraid, and yet, especially when we're tested, whatever that looks like, because that's looking so very different for so many of us right now, and there's a lot of layers to this because we're concerned for family members, we're concerned for our children, we're concerned for those who are elderly. We have all of these concerns, and yet Jesus, he says, "Don't be afraid." But right before that, he says, "It's me. It is I. Don't be afraid. Don't you know? Yeah. Don't you know who I am?" And I love that, Ryan. Just the idea of building upon, recognizing that that this is our not that we aren't to pay attention to and to recognize that some of the caution that's being given, but to see the potential, the kingdom potential in all of these different ways that God is opening up doors for us as Christians to be able to step through those doors, and to have the faith to step out of the boat, and to have the faith that when Jesus steps in and calms everything down, that's all for a purpose.
So a thought that crosses my mind as you say that. One of the comments I know you and I have both gotten from people as we've talked about evangelism and as we've talked about reaching out to neighbors and we've talked about sharing the gospel. One of the comments I know we've both gotten is, how do I do that? I don't know how to, I don't feel comfortable sitting down and having a Bible study with my neighbors. Let's simplify this for today. For just the purposes of our current culture, what an amazing opportunity to step out of the boat. How do we step out of the boat in this current culture? Maybe the way we step out of the boat in this current culture is for us to have a tangible sense of calm, for us to have a noticeable sense of peace about us. When the people around us don't, when the people who we see neighbors panicking, maybe the best evangelism right now is for us to be a sense of peace and a sense of calm that draws people to us. And now, granted, maybe it's through your social media profiles, maybe it's through your text messages and your group messaging groups that you're on. I know it can't be in person right now, but maybe the best course of evangelism, maybe the best way to step out of that boat, as you just described, is to be such an overwhelming sense of peace and an overwhelming sense of calm in your community, in your digital community, that people wonder how you got it and where it came from, and for this to be your answer.
Yeah, that peace that passes all understanding that the Apostle Paul talks about, that joy in the Lord that's found not in circumstances, but that's found in relationship with God. And I wonder if maybe in and through all of this we can't find a little bit of, maybe there's a little bit of inspiration in our isolation, and we maybe if we ask ourselves, how can we go about ministering and being a voice of calm, a voice of peace? Because I said this last Sunday morning that Christians have have always, in times of crisis, pointed toward God. And not that we would wish those times of crisis upon us, but when they come, to point all of who we are and what we hold dear and what we know to be true, to point all of that toward God, utilizes those kingdom moments for eternal purposes. And so maybe even a little bit of inspiration in our isolation, whatever that looks like. Maybe you've got a neighbor who says, "Yeah, I don't have a church family," and you say, "Well, hey, my church family is doing these things. Plug into these things, and who knows how God might utilize all of that." Any final thoughts, or before we kind of bring things together?
Only this, and my answer was going to be no until you said that last thing.
All right.
The last thing you said did bring something to mind, and that is we're in a weird culture where there's especially a younger generation that has maybe questioned the reason that we do this corporate worship and the reason we do this church involvement. Culturally, if you look at the numbers, and you've shown them in sermons, you've shown the numbers of people identifying with churches, and that number is declining. I cannot imagine a moment in our culture that has been more impactful for why we do this. We do this because, one, it gives us a sense of community, a sense of connectedness, but two, all of that community and connectedness is built around something that offers us peace and clarity and purpose and value in a moment where I don't think the culture can do that. I think outside of Jesus, outside of the faith that we all have in common, I don't think you can find what I just described in this current culture. So if you have, at any point, if you have thought, if you've fallen victim to the current cultural belief that church is something that they did in the 80s, but it's not something I need now, I hope you're taking this moment to heart and recognizing that, holy cow, this is why we do this. We do this to support each other, to be present for each other. And that on a human level is incredibly valuable, but so much more so than this, I think, is what you have said today, which is we do this because it gives us the ability to recenter and refocus on the one thing that truly matters in this life in moments where everything is up in the air. I don't care if it's coronavirus, if it's some other massive global calamity, we're going to go to this same place. No matter what that level of panic looks like, no matter what that level of chaos and destruction and whatever else you can imagine, whatever it looks like, we're going to go back to the same place. Wow, I see value in that now in a way that I don't know that I could have previously. And if that's the case, what a blessing this moment is.
Yeah, I think we're learning, maybe on a curve, but learning how to respond. The church's response to a tsunami, or the church's response to some sort of hurricane down at the coast, or a tornado that comes through Oklahoma. We've adapted and learned how to go about responding to these different events that occur around the state or country or world. This is something new that we're not the only ones that are on a learning curve.
Correct.
Here, and yet one of the things that we're really leaning into and learning from. I talked about quoting some of my favorite people. Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes that the church only exists when it exists in community. The church only exists when it exists in community. And I think that's something that we're learning. I think that's something that we're leaning into. I know that so many of you, so many of us, we are accustomed to, I do this on Sunday morning, I do this on Sunday night, I do this on Wednesday night, and I have these points of connection. And over the last couple of weeks, we found ourselves saying, this is not my norm, and it's not our norm. At the same time, this is church. This is what it means to be a part of a Christian community, and for our purposes, what it means to be a part of the Eastridge Church of Christ. And so I want to encourage you to keep plugging in. I want to encourage you to keep doing what you're doing. We're going to keep doing this week after week, but keep connecting in the different avenues that we're trying to provide for us as a church family. And even though it might not be in person, I am looking forward to seeing you on Sunday. Let's close our time together with a prayer. Father, you are good and gracious, and we are reminded of the courage and the boldness that can only be found in you, the connectedness that can only be found in the community of faith called the church. Father, and for the hope, the confidence that we have in Jesus. Father, I pray for this church family. I pray for your church the world over. I pray for humanity the world over. And God, we come to you today collectively, acknowledging you for who you are, for your goodness, for your love, for your grace, for your mercy, for your sovereignty. And Father, being reminded of our lack of control, we come to you acknowledging that you are in complete control at this time. We thank you for what you offer, what you continually give us through Jesus. And it's in his name we pray. Amen.